Welcome to the History of Nerds and I podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today we got Mike Drucker. You might know him from a billion things. He wrote for Full Frontal with Samantha Bee, Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. He's a stand-up comedian. Today he's talking about his new book, which is told basically through his life in video games. I loved it. Pure nostalgia going through my veins. If you played video games ever, you don't even need to actually know all that much about video games. Love the book. He was awesome to talk to. So how about I shut up? Let's get to Mike. And here we are with author Mike Drucker. Good Game, No Rematch, A Life Made of Video Games. Mike, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Now, Mike, you're kind of a Hollywood guy. I'm not going to call you Hollywood Mike. I think you would hate that.
I wish that were more the case, but yeah, go for it.
But listen, you've written for Full Frontal with Samantha Bee, Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, Bill Nye Saves the World. You wrote a book about your life and video games. Did you not want to just kind of burn down all your old coworkers? Isn't that the Hollywood way? That's how you sell a memoir, man.
That is how you sell a memoir. Although, like, even my most bitter stories would probably be not that interesting. I feel like my most bitter stories would be like, and then we had to go to dinner on a Wednesday, but they didn't even warn us beforehand. Like, it's not going to be as fun. And honestly, I think, video games have always been my love. Like, I didn't really get into doing comedy and becoming a comedian until, I was in college. And so this is almost more like a journey from, like, childhood to adulthood. And, I love a good showbiz memoir, but one, I don't think I have enough tantalizing stories. Rather than I have maybe anecdotal complaints, but I don't have as many tantalizing stories. And it just felt like fun to do sort of, if I was going to do like a memoir-y type book or a comedy type book about my life, it felt more fun to do it through the lens of video games than through showbiz.
Well, what I really appreciate about this book too is everything is brought back to video games. Because there's a lot of memoirs, let's just be honest, especially nowadays where it's like, oh, it's going to be about this. This is the lens I'm looking at through. And you're like, half of this has nothing to do with it.
Always, yeah.
Yeah. So was this easy for you? Like you're writing it and you're thinking, oh, this is too easy to match this up and match this up? Or were you kind of like, oh, I got to think back on that and see if there is still a connection to what I'm writing?
There was a little bit of the latter. There was a little bit of moments where I was writing something where it might have started like being like, oh, I'm going to write about this. And then as I was writing it, it sort of got away from the game. There's definitely like one or two stories about my family that I kind of, if I needed to include more, would have liked to have included them, but they don't have almost anything to do with games. And so, I'd find a moment where I was like, am I bending over backwards to get the story about my mom doing something funny at a birthday party just because I want it in the book, even though it has literally nothing to do with any games. So that was definitely a consideration. On the flip side, I think in stand-up comedy, and this sounds dumb, but like one of the things that has always annoyed me is like when you go to like a themed show. I've done like shows where it's like it's a Father's Day show. We're just going to do shows about dads or something. And then you get there and people on stage or other comedians will be like, my dad's always dating. I just went on a date this week. And you're like, okay, clearly you're using this as a shoehorn to get into something completely unrelated that you have a bit about. And I really wanted to avoid doing that.
And something else that I think it's really important. So anybody who's listening right now is like, I don't know video games. There's a real heart to this. Like the big thing, and it goes throughout, is your relationship with your father, which I think everyone can kind of pull on this thread, which is sometimes you and your parents, you can love each other, but almost not quite understand each other. And that's a big part of this, right? Is that your dad wanted you to be a sports guy, and in your own words, you're not that interested or good at the sports thing, right?
Yeah. Also, and to his credit, it wasn't even that he wanted me to play sports. It was more like he wanted me to have the same interests as him. And we definitely had a lot of conflict over it, but it wasn't like, my son doesn't play sports, he must be a wuss. It was a lot more like, I don't understand how to connect with my son because he does not like the same things I do. Maybe if I force him to go to football games, he'll like sports. So there was also almost like a sadness in the connection in the other direction as well. It wasn't just like, my dad doesn't like that I don't like sports. It was sort of like my dad also being like, my son doesn't like sports. Is there something wrong with me? And that was always an interesting relationship as a kid.
This book made me think so much about my own life growing up. My brothers are 6 and 7 years older than me. Mm-hmm. And it seemed like they really got into sports, but they were a little bit older, whereas I remember when my middle brother bought his Nintendo, he still says to this day, I wasn't there, but I can tell him exactly what happened. And I remember that Nintendo coming home for the first time, and it was just a whole new world where they grew up where there were a lot more kids in the neighborhood. by the time I was there wasn't nearly as many. And a video game was just a way to, you're not watching TV, you're making that connection, and like it does something to your brain. Like, do you kind of remember that?
Definitely. Like, it almost feels like part of my life started when I first started getting video games, because that's when I really did remember playing things like Duck Hunt or Mario. You know, it was almost like it activated an imagination center in my brain. I'm sure the way that some, you know, for some people it's like the right Saturday morning cartoon does, or, you know, the right, you know, middle grade novel series from Bruce Coville might, you know, like, but I think for a lot of us, and maybe you and I included, it's sort of like that one video game hit is when you're like, oh, this is what the world can be.
And a lot of things can change. Now I love football on Sundays, but it took me a while to get there. And it also was just another way, especially with my brothers. I remember when I got really good at Street Fighter 2.
Yeah.
And I could beat them and some of their friends. Like I was the annoying little brother, but that was that one thing that I had where I'm like, this I'm good at and you guys can't beat me.
Yeah, you've seen it in the book. I read about it in the book, but it's almost the reverse where, like, my little brother's the one who's good at sports, so he'll come and, like, beat me and my friends who are 4 years older than him just because he's, like, so good that he's included in the group.
So I'd like an apology from you.
Yes, sir.
Right off the bat, you bring up, this is in my review, so everybody, if you're going to be triggered, here it comes. You start off with the Duck Hunt dog.
Yeah.
That little bastard.
That little
laughing
bastard.
at you whenever you don't shoot the ducks. If you're not old enough, I'm sure there's a YouTube video on it. But it was probably the most obnoxious thing as a child.
Yeah.
How visceral is that in your mind, remembering that?
There's a very 1980s phrase to say, but as a kid holding a small toy gun, you're not very accurate. And so, you know, you're like still trying to figure it out. And you're like, oh, this is cool. I got this new toy. And immediately being bad at it because I was, you know, 3 or 4, you know, that pixelated dog comes up and just laughs at you. And as a little kid, you don't even really know what you're doing wrong yet. So it feels like you're not just failing, but this new high-tech toy is laughing at you for it.
And especially when you're talking about video games back in the day, and you get into this in the book. Now, if you're playing video games, you're not an outsider. But if you were super into it back in the day, it was a little weird, especially if you tried to make girls like you through video games. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think I have 2 stories in the book where I try to impress a girl or a woman, depending on the story. And one of them, early on in the book, it was around the time of Super Mario 3 coming out. And, you know, when I was a little boy, Super Mario 3 was a very big deal. There was commercials about it. The Wizard had featured it. Magazine covers for the few gaming magazines that there were before there were a lot, and then there weren't any. And so I just assumed everybody loved Mario as much as me, or at the very least, he was such a ubiquitous character that even if you weren't a Nintendo fan, you knew who he was. And I think my leap of logic was you'd be on board with him. In one of the stories, I actually made a DIY Super Mario 3 costume for myself, where I grew up in South Florida, which is always hot, wearing and when I say DIY, I don't mean like my mom helped me with it or we went to the store. I mean, I found pieces of cardboard and like black sock and slapped together the most embarrassing Super Mario costume on. The only thing that was Super Mario related was maybe my body shape at that point. That was like the closest to accuracy I had, was the shape and height of my body was like Mario after getting hit by a Goomba. But otherwise, it was just such an embarrassing costume. But I really, really thought that like I would show up and this girl, and she was a twin. She and her twin
2
sister.
for 1. You didn't just get the one, you get 2 for 1.
Yeah, I really hope that like they would be like, oh, it's Mario, and invite me in. And like I was still a very little boy, so it wasn't like I had like some like devious plan past that where I was like, they're gonna hook me in and then it's kissing time. Like I think at best that's where it would be like, maybe they'll kiss me. I didn't even know what that was.
Now, I have to talk about at least one omission, especially when we're talking about early Nintendo right now.
Yeah.
You talk about the Power Glove. Everyone remembers that. I did notice the Power Pad is not part of the book. Did you not have a Power Pad? Did you hear the stories about they had to take the Power Pad away because kids kept having heart attacks from running on it too much?
I actually didn't know that heart attack story. We did not have the power pad. We had bought the action set, which had just had, or the action pack or whatever it's called, that just had the zapper and the console. I had a couple friends who had the power pad. I didn't play it enough, though, that it was like such an integral thing. And, going back to what we had said earlier, I also made a decision to not try to, just like I tried to not shoehorn things into game stories, I also was like, don't just try to shoehorn in a game because you think people want you to talk about it. Like my editor on the book, he's a big Kingdom Hearts fan. He's like, you should do something about Kingdom Hearts. And I was like, well, I like Kingdom Hearts just fine, but I don't really have anything connected to it, so I don't know what I can do with it in terms of like a story about my life. So the power pad was around when I was a kid. It's just, since I didn't own it, it wasn't like constantly embarrassing me.
Well, and especially about not shoehorning things in, you also make it, like I said, universal. Like I don't want somebody to hear, it's about video games. I don't know video games. I don't want to read it. But like you even have a section, like I never did any tabletop games like D&D, Dungeons & Dragons and all that stuff. And as much as I didn't know, I could still read those chapters and be like, I get it. Because there is that universal trying to make a connection, just like with video games now. I know plenty of kids who don't go anywhere, but they have tons of friends because they can just put on their headphones and lock in for the weekend. But especially for the tabletop games, that's kind of an extremely social thing as well, right?
Yeah, and like, even with the tabletop thing, like I wanted to give context for everything. When I was beginning to write this book, I was reading a couple movie-style type memoirs, not like movie stars, but people who wrote about movies in their lives and music in their lives. And one of the things that I found was that for things that were even maybe one step more obscure, people went out of their way to give context. And so whether it be the tabletop section or the video game section, throughout the book, I really try to give the reader context where, look, if you hate video games, I doubt that this book is going to convert you, but I also didn't want it to be like well, I've never played that game, so this chapter is completely indecipherable to me. It's almost like I want to be like, as long as you're on board, I will try to sit you down and walk you through as much of it as I can.
I will say I think that's true, except for one chapter.
Okay.
There is one chapter about BioShock where I was sitting there and I'm going, did he just say Rapture?
Yeah.
Wait, what is... Oh, I know. It took me like 2 pages, but I'm like, okay. And it just felt like an Easter egg almost in the book.
Yeah. There's a couple what I call interstitials in there where it's like a slightly like shorter, jokier sections. And those were inspired by, I was while writing about my life, there's 1 or 2 stories that do get a little intense emotionally. And I was just kind of like, I want to write something that's almost completely fluff, but not fluff like I made up a story, fluff like here's like a funny, almost like, on John Oliver when they say, and now here's this, and there's like a 1-minute thing that's almost a palate cleanser. And so with the BioShock piece, I kind of thought about the fact that it's, supposed to be this perfect libertarian capitalist paradise where you are, titans of industry can live in mansions and do any science or creativity they want without the bounds of regulations or laws. But it's also in the middle of the frozen Atlantic Ocean, kilometers beneath the sea. And so I just sort of wrote about that idea of like a brochure for that, of the idea behind like selling someone for that. Because if I had millions and millions of dollars and someone's like, you want to live where no one can ever stop you, be like, yeah, and they'd be like, okay, but it's also somewhere where if you die, no one will ever know. Like, I kind of would be like, wait, I'm not sure I want to be that free from regulation.
Would you kindly, and the video game nerds know what you just did there.
Yeah.
You worked at Nintendo.
I did.
I can't imagine, that's like me actually making money off of this podcast. It would be amazing. I can't imagine it. You're talking about you've written a book, your life of video games, and you worked at Nintendo. What was that like?
It was very good. I will say, without a doubt, Nintendo is one of the few places I've worked where I left loving it more than I came in with. And I already loved it. I was already a big fanboy. It's just, it was a place that treated people right. Really, the only reason I ended up leaving was just comedy was starting to take off. And, I kind of had to make a choice between what I had or what was in front of me. The wisdom of that is still questioned by me to this day. But, it was a really nice company. It's a company that really cares about its employees. It's also a company that really cares about its products. I was only there maybe 2.5 years, and there were conversations about sales and stuff. But even though I was in the treehouse, which is a pretty important department where we're, localizing games, we're also meeting with the marketing departments to talk about the games. Cause, often the treehouse, the time I was there was kind of like the hub for a lot of things. I'd talk to the person who's doing the North American box art for it. If they were making changes, I would talk to, there was one time I had to talk to a radio station because they were going to be promoting a game I had worked on. And it wasn't an interview so much as like they just wanted instructions on how it worked and what it was before they did their segment. But it was never like we're trying to meet this sales goal for the year, or like, okay, everybody, one hard push and then we'll finally make it a million seller. It always really felt about the quality of the product and about the customer. And I don't say that I don't benefit from them anymore. I don't have to be this nice about it. It just always struck me as a place that actually really did care about the player and about their fans. And I still love a lot of the people there. I was at the DICE Awards a couple weeks ago in Vegas. I got drunk with my old boss, who in the book I call the handsomest man at Nintendo, and he's still...
Multiple times.
Multiple times. Also, someone got him a copy of the book, and he found out about that and definitely asked me about that. But, like, you know, like, again, like, it's been over a decade since I was there, but I can still, like, see someone from the company and be like, oh, man, and we'll, like, hang out for an hour and talk and hang out. Again, I can only speak for when I was there, obviously, and only my experience, but my experience there was fantastic.
Now, can you talk about, you said localizing games. Can you talk a little bit about actually what you were doing? I don't think a lot of people know about these types of jobs and how important they are for a game, because it doesn't come out fully formed, and there's so many different pieces, and if it's going to different countries, can you talk a little bit about what you needed to do?
Of course. Localization is what a lot of people would colloquially call translation. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Translation might be like if a presidential candidate or a politician is giving a speech and then someone's next to them translating it into another language. You're trying to do it word for word as exactly as you can, because in that moment that person's either speaking on the fly or, you know, at a Q&A at Comic-Con or something. Localization is a little more like you have, whether it be the text, the manga, the movie, the video game, and you're working with a translator to make it make as much sense in a different language. And there's a difference, because when you're telling a story, that's a little bit different than like a businessman giving a speech who has to be exact on his digits. In stories, there's things like jokes or even idioms that aren't jokes. You know, if you translated a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush into another language directly and that idiom doesn't exist, it'll just sound like gibberish. But you might want your character to really convey that meaning through something, so my translator might be like, well, you know, this phrase is probably closest to this, or this phrase is, you know, connotating that if you're too selfish, you'll end up with nothing. Do we have something like that? And so it's really you're working with the team on making sure that everything that these characters are saying and that's happening in the game isn't just loyal to the original text, but also gives the player the same emotional response. You want them to laugh in the same moments. You want them to feel emotional in the same moments. You want them to be angry at the same times. And, you know, the way people speak in different languages has different rhythms and tones and ways about them. And if you directly one-to-one translated a Japanese character's dramatic speech, it might land with you a little different just because there's a different cultural way of thinking about something. Let me put it this way. If my translator was out or was busy or was working on something else, I would sometimes get an email from the developer that I would have to Google Translate. And it wasn't frowned upon. It was more like we all are keeping track of each other. And sometimes I'm just like, you know, and I would often get a message that would directly translate as "you look tired." So it'd be like, "Hey, Mike, you look tired. Here's, you know, the next portion of the text for XYZ." Or, "Hey, you look tired. We had a question about this." And early on, I was informed that basically means we noticed that you seem tired. You must have been working very hard on this. So it's a compliment. It's a compliment in the sense of like, I can tell how exhausted you are. Thank you so much for working so hard. That's kind of the tone of it. But when you read it in just straight English, it almost sounds vaguely either like a compliment or a neg in some weird way, where it's almost like, "Hey, you look tired." You're like, "What? You don't even see me. What do you mean I look tired or I seem tired?" And so it's like that, though. Like when someone explains it to you, you're like, "Oh, that makes sense." But if someone, let's say you just received a professional email and it started with, "Hey, you look tired," you'd be like, I need to figure out what that means.
Or, "Hey, screw you, dude."
Or, "Screw you, dude." Or are you making fun of me? Or are you being sarcastic? Like you're saying that I don't look like I've been working hard enough? Culturally, and I don't mean like culturally we have different views of being tired, but just certain phrasings hit you differently depending on the intent behind it, but also what you're used to hearing culturally. And so it's a lot of that. And it's a lot of minutia. And, you know, sometimes it's also as simple as, you know, on the flip side, when I worked on Mario Party 9, a lot of it was just making sure that the terms we were using now matched up to terms we were using in the past, even if Japan had changed a term. Occasionally, like, Japan would change a term they're using, and then we would ask Japan, "Do you want us to change the term we use for that? Or do you want us to keep our term the same?" So even little things like that, like referring to style guides, making sure style guides are up to date on things like, you know, Donkey Kong, All of that stuff is part of the localization process, and it's really fun. And I'll also say, one of the, I think, misinterpretations people have, and I address this in the book, is that in the 80s and 90s, a lot of this stuff was like a Japanese company handing a guy a stack of text and saying, translate this. This is going to be Final Fantasy VII. And nowadays, these games are developed as they're being localized. So it's not just like, okay, here's the original God's word. You go ruin it. Now we're on emails with these folks, and these folks will be like, hey, why'd you name this character this? Or, hey, we noticed this. Could you explain this back to us? And so it's actually it's a dialogue between us localizing it and the people who can still pretty much understand English, reading that new text and interpreting it their own way and having their own questions about it. And then, after that, we pass it on to the other languages who do their own pass.
And any old gamer will know that you'll sometimes, back in the day, open up a box, read something, and be like, what the hell does that mean?
Yeah.
But thank God for you, Mike Drucker. Thank God for you. Now, You did move on from Nintendo, like you said, comedy, you're doing lots of writing, you're in all of these amazing places. Did being a video game nerd ever help after Nintendo?
It definitely did. It definitely did. Having Nintendo on your resume is a very fun thing because people always want to talk about it. And when I interviewed for a job it was in Late Night with Jimmy Fallon and then became The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon when I was there, I knew Jimmy Fallon was a video game fan. And I didn't get the interview because he was. I got the interview because I'd been doing comedy and I did the Montreal New Faces and the Montreal Comedy Festival and I'd been freelancing for Weekend Update for a little while. And just through sheer force of luck, I was able to get an interview. But knowing that he loved video games, I wore like an official Legend of Zelda thing that I got at the Nintendo store that was for employees only. I really made sure just to drop little hints to games that I knew he liked from interviews, because I also did my research. I knew he liked video games, but I made sure to look into what games he liked. Because you and I both know that just because someone says they like games does not mean they like all games.
Correct.
And that actually really helped. It gave us something else to talk about that was something other than just work. It was also a nice sign that I was interested in something he was interested in and not just the money the show had to pay me as a writer. It definitely is something that excites people. I don't have any kids of my own, but I'll meet people's kids and I feel like they'll mention that even though I haven't been there in 10 years. Because that is the closest thing that they have to the uncle that works at Nintendo.
It's still so universal. My daughter just turned 10. And when she's here, it's, hey, we got time for Mario Kart? I'm like, yeah, we got time for Mario Kart. We always got time for Mario Kart. And she's beat me a couple times, so I'm kind of annoyed about it, and we don't do it as much. But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah.
It's not about me, Mike. This is about you.
Of course.
So I do want to ask something. Are you more proud of being mocked by Zach Braff on national TV or being killed in Mortal Kombat?
That is a good question. I was played by, because I interned at Saturday Night Live for a while, and I was a researcher there while also being a freelancer for Weekend Update. It was very cool to be played by Zach Braff because it actually really, I was an intern when that happened, so that was almost the equivalent of someone famous being like, hey, we noticed you. And it wasn't I didn't get anything out of it. It wasn't that helped my career in any way, but it was kind of nice to be 21 or 22, just starting comedy, just landed this lucky job internship, and kind of having famous people being like, we noticed you, so we threw your name in there. And so that was a really big feeling. Getting killed in Mortal Kombat, which happened much later, because I had mentioned I was on a Mortal Kombat podcast and they added my name to a list of names of people who were killed by the Terminator in the Mortal Kombat 11 DLC. That was almost this moment of oh man, I've done okay.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Not I've done okay, everything's gonna be okay, I can retire, but sort of I've lived an interesting enough life. And the two together are also nice, where it's someone has played me on Saturday Night Live and I've been killed in Mortal Kombat. It was a cool moment. It kind of felt like this, I don't know, it almost felt like this very strange sort of I've had a place in this world. There's a record of me existing somehow.
You've got those two, so let me make it a little bit harder, right? So either one of those things or being on fire in NBA Jam, which I contend is the greatest feeling for any human being. Anybody who knows it knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Those are three real good feelings.
I'd say the first time it happened, because I didn't know it was going to happen, that might have been the best. Because I think when I got NBA Jam, I didn't even read the manual. I just knew it was supposed to be good. So when it happened, I was like, what? So maybe just that once. Maybe that one first time.
The one first time. Okay. All right. What's a Steam review and how do you feel about them?
Steam reviews are the same thing as an Amazon review where, you'll buy a product, usually obviously a game on Steam or a piece of software on Steam, and, you leave a review. And Steam reviews are interesting in that, first of all, you can sort of give it a thumbs up or down, kind of, and it'll list how long you've played it. And most of the reviews are normal people leaving normal reviews. Occasionally, though, you will get a review written by someone who, and occasionally, and by normal, I mean both good and bad. Sometimes you'll get a bad review that's like, I put in 10 hours. I just don't think that this DLC is not worth $30. How dare they? Or, I put in 15 hours and I liked it, but it's not as good as the next one. Or if you're not into it. But occasionally you'll get these insane people where it'll say like they played like 1,000 hours or like 2,000 hours and they'll hate the game. And you almost respect it because you know that their hate's coming from a place of deep knowledge and participation. Like they're not saying I hate it because... it's easier for me to dismiss someone hating a game if they're like, I don't think the woman's hot enough. And I'm like, okay, well, you don't look at her face for 95% of the game, and what does that matter? But when someone's put in like 2,000 hours, I'm like, you know what? You put in the time to hate this. You have every right to hate it. What's funny, though, is usually those complaints from those people are the same as the complaints from people who played like 5 hours. It's almost like they got in there like, I hate this, but I'm going to have a marriage-length relationship with this game just so I know I hate it.
I want to ask, this is a really tough question, but I'm going to throw it at you.
Sure.
I can magically, like Men in Black, wipe your mind.
Yeah.
All right? But for one video game, so that you could go back and experience that game as if you never played it before for the first time.
Yeah.
Which game is it?
That's a really interesting question. And I think my answer would either be The Sims or Planescape Torment. And the reason that those are my two answers is one, both, even Sims 1, because they just re-released it, both still hold up today. So if, let's say, like you were like, you never played, let's say The Sims was not as famous as it is, and it was like, it was more like Populous, if anyone remembers old video games, which was like an old game where you played God. And let's say you're like, you've never played The Sims? Oh man, you gotta play it, it's still good. And I was like, it's 25 years old, and you're like, no, just give it a shot. I would still love it. And the same goes for Planescape Torment. Other games like Mario 64, I would love to play that with fresh eyes. I also know that playing it as a new game right now is not the same as playing it as a new game in 1996. But Planescape Torment and The Sims to me, I think would blow my mind at, like me at 40 as they did when I was 16.
Yes, for me, it would probably be BioShock or either of the Red Dead Redemptions.
Also a good call. Same thing where those games hold up just as well now as they did before.
Yeah, and I also, I could replay it right now. Like I got to the BioShock chapter and I'm like, damn, I got to go back and play that. The only other one, actually, I should add to this because I thought about this, Dead Space, the first Dead Space.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I got that, and Lady History Nerd watched that for 5 minutes. She's like, I'm not playing or watching this anymore. Yeah. And I'm like, it's so good, though, and it's absolutely nuts. If somebody's on here, somebody on the younger side, and they're like, I want to get into video games as an industry.
Yes.
Do you have any secrets, any tips for somebody to be like, I want to be Mike Drucker 2.0? How do they do it?
Well, first of all, I'd warn you against being me. You don't want this. But as far as getting into games, I would say figure out what you want to do in games first. And that could change. If you want to be a programmer, start learning programming. If you want to be a writer, start writing. And there's a lot of tools where you can make your own games. You can make your own small games, or, even things like Mario Maker. Start playing around with it. You might think in your head, I want to design video games. I have the perfect video game design in my head. If you never test that theory, you might end up hitting an end of things that you don't really like. So I would say try to make them now, even crappy ones. I'm not saying make them to put on Steam and sell. But there's so many tools available that'll let you make crappy little individual things, and that'll help guide you and steer you. It's sort of like when people ask how to get into comedy, I'm like, listen, doing an open mic sucks, but when you do that, it'll at least give you an idea of what you liked about it or didn't like about it. The worst scenario in either comedy or video games is sort of saying, I knew I'd be good at this, but I never tried it. Because then you just never... I would rather know I suck at something and give up than to tell myself my whole life that I would have been great at this if I ever tried it at all. And I think with games, it's really just try to make something. If you want to write about games, start, your own newsletter. It's hard, and nobody knows what they're doing. And I don't mean that facetiously. I mean, I don't know what I'm doing. My friends don't know what they're doing. I'm having drinks with another friend who doesn't know what she's doing, who's in this industry, and we're going to talk about how we both don't know what we're doing. But with that, take comfort in that means that nobody has it figured out, so you have the chance to still be figuring it out. You know, there's no secret passcode. It's not like we all have a secret handshake that we do and then we're in the industry. It's sort of like you kind of have to keep hitting against the walls until you find a door.
Should people be worried about the video game industry nowadays? Like, there's a lot going around about people getting laid off, and it seems like it takes years to put something out. Video games are becoming, or maybe they were before this, almost like these huge tentpole movies where it's years, it's hundreds of millions of dollars, and it seems like, and this is probably just old me, it seems like there's less video games, and some of them are amazing, and they'll put effort behind them, and some of them it's like, well, that sucked, pull that back. Is this just growing pains for the industry, or do you see dark clouds on the horizon?
I think it's not necessarily growing pains as it is a transformation period. I think you're right. I think, the problem is the better games look. If you're trying to make a big budget, explosions and big graphics and, ultra high fidelity and a ton of multiplayer modes and all the bells and whistles, it takes years and often hundreds of millions of dollars, just like a giant blockbuster. And the problem is that for a lot of these game companies, if it doesn't sell well immediately, it's not considered a success. And so you're not just putting all this money into this project for 6 years. It's almost like I'm going to spend 6 years and spend $300 million on a game, but if it doesn't earn that back in the first 2 months, I'm going to consider it a failure. Occasionally, you do have games that sort of have that sort of Friends or Suits situation where it goes viral later and sort of finds a new audience and becomes bigger. But that often happens to indie games more than AAA games. I'm not an expert. I'm not a businessman. And Nintendo ran things differently than a lot of these companies because I think Nintendo's philosophy is, we're Nintendo. We'll do it our way. But for companies that are laying off studios, spending all this money, I think that there's a sense of realizing that you can't keep throwing money at the same problem and that'll fix it. That'll just keep wasting money. And there actually are a ton of great games out there. It's just that a ton of them are small indie games that very few people find, or only a couple people find, or in the case of something like Balatro, luckily everybody finds. For me, I get far more satisfaction out of finding a game on Steam and being like, I don't know what this is, but it costs $5, and I'll buy it. It'll be like a short horror game that gives me a great 3-hour horror experience. To me, that is what I love. I'll still buy a $70 AAA game when it comes out, but the discovery of something little and being like, all right, well, it's $5, it doesn't matter, there's $10, and then really finding something that you think nobody else knows about, to me, that's where a lot of the magic is. On the downside, there's so many indie games that it's not like, well, I'll just make a game with me and my 5 friends, automatically means you're going to get that money back.
I mean, my daughter's favorite game is Untitled Goose Game.
Yeah. Exactly.
Which I hadn't heard of, and I'm like, oh, did they not put it out yet? And there's no title. She goes, no, that's what it's called. I'm like, okay. And then I heard a goose for 6 hours because she just kept hitting the button. I'm sorry, I'm completely off. But that's one of those games. It was $2.99 or something. She's like, I love this. I'm like, $2.99, sure, whatever. I'm not dropping $60.
Yeah, and it won awards. It took home a ton of awards because people loved it because it was interesting and innovative and fun. I think a lot of these companies, especially, and I think showbiz and video games have become closer than ever because they're all owned by the same conglomerates. It's a lot of I think a lot of video games and video game executives are kind of stuck in when I say the consumer era of games, I don't mean that consumers buy it. I mean that, when you and I were growing up, video game reviews weren't in the arts and entertainment section. They were in the technology section. And that does put a cultural buffer zone. When you review a movie, sometimes you'll be like, man, this movie drags on, so be prepared for a 4-hour movie. But you're rarely like, this movie was amazing, but at only 95 minutes, I cannot recommend it to anybody. With video games, you do get that. People will be like, this is the best experience of my life. It was only 10 hours, though, so I don't think it's good. And so I think we still have this original sin of treating them almost like toasters, where instead of being how great of an artistic experience or how good of a entertainment experience even, we often get how much value do I derive out of my money put into this? Which, you can abstract with art, but I think has at times caused a lot of these business people to think, well, we got to put in the kitchen sink. Polls say that they want live game, features. So we got to put all these extra features in. They want loot boxes. We'll put loot boxes in. They don't like loot boxes. We'll take them out. And so there's a lot of chasing what everybody wants, which I think ends up making it sort of like a product for nobody sometimes.
If you had to guess, which game do you think you're going to end up playing the most this year?
That is a very good question. I have not played Civilization 7 yet because I'm waiting for them to sort of patch it up a little bit. Civilization 7, though, once those patches start rolling, that could definitely be one because I put a good amount of time in the others. I just got 2 Points Museum, 2 Points Museum, I should say, which is amazing. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically you run a museum. It's like Sim Museum. And it is so fun and delightful, and I'm someone who loves museums a lot, so running a museum to me is something that excites me, even if it doesn't excite 95% of the population. So that so far has like really sucked up a ton of time. But like I've been enjoying Avowed. Avowed's a pretty short game for a role-playing game, but I could see myself giving it another run. I mean, we'll see what happens when I play Monster Hunter. Once I get into that could suck up the rest of my year. For right now, though, as far as things I own, I would say 2 Points 2 Points Museum. I keep saying Hospital because I also loved Hospital.
Now, you put this book out, and as we talked about, and kind of bringing it full circle, there's a lot of family stuff in here, too, about how all of that. Do you ever get concerned, especially when you're writing this? I always ask people who write memoirs, like, these are real people, these are family, these are people who you may get a phone call from. Why the hell did you put that in there, man? Any concerns there, or do you think there's some catharsis here? Because I know how I felt. I felt like there was a lot here to get from a family perspective in a positive way.
Yeah.
But is there ever concern when you're writing stuff, you're like, oh, maybe I don't want to put that one in there?
Sure, yeah, and there's definitely stuff I left out. Whether it be because, I have I wouldn't say fraught relationship with my dad, but definitely it was turbulent at times. And there's things that I was like, it's not worth going into, the darkest chapter of things necessarily, or something that's a little more complicated, or a story that has nothing to do with games, but is a dramatic family story again. That said, once the book was in a reasonable shape, this is already after it was already sold, but before it was finalized, I actually let my family read it. And my dad asked for 5 changes. I gave him 2 of the 5, and they were small. It wasn't like I changed it so he didn't do something. It was more like, the way you phrase this makes me feel like I look professionally not as good. Is there a way you could change the phrasing of this? And I'm like, you know what? Yeah, because I did not intend that. More than happy to. I forget what the other thing was. It wasn't even like a battle. It was more like he was like, could you change these things? And I was like, I could do this and that. So I tried to at least approach it with the respect of being like, I'm letting you know what's in here. Like, I didn't want it to come out and then, even though I can have a rough relationship with my family, I didn't want it to come out and feel like I was blindsiding them, or like, using video games to write a book to start a fight with them in public in some weird way, which my family is apt to assume.
Well, listen, I absolutely loved it, but, there are people who are like, it's nonfiction, it's about video games, it's not for me. I know how much is in there, but if I sat one of those people in front of you and they said, I'm not a video game person, why should I read this? What would you say?
I would say, well, it's really more like a comedy about most of it's a comedy about a very weird family, and then it becomes a comedy about a very weird man who doesn't know how to exist in the world. So it's really less of a nonfiction book about video games themselves. It's not a history book. It is not a business breakdown. It's more like using video games to show how, we kind of build our own worlds around ourselves when we don't quite fit in. And I think that feeling is familiar to a lot of people. Like I said, a lot of this book was inspired by similar books about movies or music where people are like, this is how this art form made me the person I am today.
Mike, I loved it. I think everybody will. Thank you so much for coming on and talk about it.
Thank you very much.
And that's it for this episode. Mike, thank you so much. Good game, no rematch. I loved it. You'll love it. Go out and get it. In the meantime, hit us up Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History